I went to the airport to see a friend off, and froze when I saw my husband wrapped around another woman in the departure lounge. I stepped closer, heart pounding, and heard him whisper, "Everything is ready. That fool is going to lose everything." In that moment, everything inside me went quiet. I didn't confront him, I didn't make a scene. I just smiled. Because the plan he was so proud of was already falling apart. And he had no idea I was the one who made sure of it. The airport ambience was a suffocating layer of chaotic noise, a disturbed beehive of frantic travelers and mechanical hums that seemed to vibrate against the very marrow of my bones. Standing by the towering glass wall of the terminal, I watched the silhouette of my best friend, Ashley, slowly dissolve into the sea of passengers lining up for the boarding gate. The flight to Miami was running 30 minutes late, a delay that felt like a physical weight in the stagnant air, yet Ashley had been adamant that I shouldn't linger. "Go home to Noah," she had urged with a final, lingering hug, her voice laced with that effortless warmth she always carried, promising that we would be reunited in a mere week. I forced a smile I didn't feel, my heart tethered to a home that had gradually become a collection of cold rooms and unspoken grievances. For months, the house I shared with Ethan had ceased to feel like a sanctuary, transforming instead into a gallery of his absences and my growing isolation. He was a senior partner at a prestigious law firm, a title that apparently required him to sacrifice every evening to urgent cases and late-night strategy sessions. Even when he was physically present, his spirit was a ghost haunting our hallways, his mind perpetually locked behind a door I no longer had the key to. Even the monumental revelation of my pregnancy, the news that we were bringing another life into the world, had failed to ignite the spark of joy I had so desperately anticipated. He had merely nodded, his eyes drifting back to his laptop, leaving me to navigate the tides of morning sickness and burgeoning hope entirely on my own. "Maybe he is just drowning in work," I whispered to myself, my hand instinctively coming to rest on the slight, barely perceptible curve of my belly. As a family physician, I spent my days diagnosing the ailments of others, dissecting symptoms with clinical precision, yet when it came to the rot at the foundation of my own marriage, my professional intuition seemed to fail me. Seeking a moment of normalcy before facing the long drive back to an empty bed, I turned toward a small coffee shop tucked away in the waiting area. I just needed a bottle of water, a simple errand to ground myself, but in that mundane corner of John F. Kennedy International Airport, the fragile architecture of my life collapsed into ruins. There, partially obscured by a massive concrete pillar, sat my husband. The man who had kissed me goodbye the previous night, claiming he had an indispensable business trip to Chicago, was currently entwined with a young blonde woman in a vibrant, flashy pink suit. They weren't sitting like colleagues discussing a brief, they were clinging to one another with the desperate, feverish intensity of teenagers in the throes of a first love. The floor seemed to liquefy beneath my feet, a sudden surge of adrenaline turning my mouth to ash as my pulse thundered in my ears like a funeral drum. I recoiled instantly, pressing my back against the cold stone of the pillar, praying to a god I hadn't spoken to in years that I remained unseen. Peeking around the edge, I watched Ethan's fingers trace the back of the woman's hand with a tenderness he hadn't shown me in years. She laughed, a light, melodic sound that felt like a serrated blade against my skin, her head tilting back in a gesture of pure adoration. My breath hitched as I recognized her, Pamela. She was the 25-year-old paralegal from Ethan's office, the name that had peppered his dinner conversations for months. Pamela had a brilliant mind for streamlining documents. Pamela was a visionary in the office. Pamela stayed late to ensure every T was crossed. Now, with a nauseating clarity that had nothing to do with my 12-week pregnancy, I realized exactly what they were streamlining in those dark after-hours. The betrayal hit me with the force of a physical blow, a crushing weight that threatened to buckle my knees. 5 years of marriage, a 4-year-old son waiting at home, and a second child growing inside me. Did these milestones mean so little to the man I had built my existence around? Part of me screamed to erupt from my hiding place, to shatter their illicit peace with a scene of righteous fury and demand an explanation for this cruelty. But the physician in me, the woman trained to gather every scrap of data before making a life-altering incision, held me back. I moved with the stealth of a predator, weaving through the clusters of weary travelers until I was close enough to catch the low, conspiratorial murmur of their voices. "Everything will be settled soon," Ethan was saying, his voice a low purr as he caressed Pamela's cheek with sickening affection. "Once we get to court, we will secure every last dime down to the penny." Pamela's brow furrowed, her voice tinged with a shallow mimicry of concern. What if she suspects something? she asked, her eyes searching his. Ethan let out a dismissive, arrogant smirk that made my skin crawl. Emily is far too trusting, he replied, his words dripping with a condescension I had never truly let myself see until now. She's a doctor, not a lawyer. She doesn't have the capacity to understand the intricacies of estate law or the maneuvers I've put in place. Besides, with the pregnancy, she's emotionally unstable and fragile. Even if she stumbled onto the truth, who would believe the ramblings of a hysterical woman? I gritted my teeth so hard I feared they might crack. Emotionally unstable? I would show him exactly how unstable a mother protecting her children could be. But Pamela wasn't finished. What about the documents? The evidence of the will? She pressed. Ethan's confidence was a palpable, oily presence. It's all safely tucked away in my red folder, and that folder stays locked in my office, he assured her. She has no access to that world. After the hearing, we'll be millionaires, Pamela. And my wife, my son? We'll divorce. I'll leave her just enough so she doesn't starve, but I'm taking the boy. A son needs his father's influence. As for the one on the way, he shrugged, a gesture of such profound indifference it felt like a cold hand around my throat. We'll see. With all the stress she's under, it might not even make it to term. The blood rushed to my face, a searing heat of pure, unadulterated rage. This man, the father of my son, was sitting in a public terminal calmly plotting the systematic destruction of my life. He wasn't just planning to leave, he was planning to rob me of my inheritance, my dignity, and my children. They're calling our flight, Pamela said, standing up and smoothing her pink suit. It's time to go, honey. Miami, not Chicago. Just another lie to add to the mounting pile of his infidelities. I watched as he pulled her into a long, passionate kiss, the kind of kiss that had been absent from our marriage for over a year. In 1 week, he whispered against her lips, "We will be free and rich." I stood frozen as they walked toward the gate, watching the man I thought I knew disappear into a future that didn't include me. Something inside me snapped, but it wasn't my heart that had already gone numb with the first sight of them. It was the last of my illusions, my misplaced faith, and the naive belief in the sanctity of our family. As the initial agony began to recede, it was replaced by a cold, calculating fury. Ethan had made the fatal mistake of underestimating the woman he shared a bed with. I might be a doctor, but I was intelligent, I was observant, and I had a memory like a steel trap. More importantly, I possessed the one thing Ethan had clearly traded away for greed, a conscience. The red folder. The phrase looped in my mind like a mantra. I had a spare key to his office tucked away at home, a relic from a time when he claimed he wanted me to have access in case of an emergency. It seemed the emergency had finally arrived. For the first time in an hour, a faint, predatory smile touched my lips. Ethan wanted to play a game of high stakes, and he had forgotten that I was just as capable of navigating a crisis as he was. I reached into my bag, dialing Mrs. Davis, our son's devoted caregiver. "Mrs. Davis, it's Emily," I said, my voice remarkably steady. "Could you watch Noah tonight? Something urgent has come up, a matter of the highest priority." When I arrived home, 4-year-old Noah was waiting at the door, a mess of golden curls and innocent eyes, holding up a drawing. "Look, Mommy," he beamed, pointing to the stick figures. "It's us, the family." I knelt down, pulling him into a hug so tight I could feel the rhythmic thrum of his little heart. How was I supposed to tell him that the man in the drawing was a monster? "It's beautiful, sweetie," I whispered, kissing his forehead. "Where's Daddy?" he asked. "He said he'd bring me a toy from Miami." I felt a fresh wave of bitterness. What would Ethan bring back? A new life for himself built on the wreckage of ours? I managed to convince Mrs. Davis to stay the night, citing a medical emergency at the clinic. After tucking Noah into bed and reading him a story about a hero who defeated a dark sorcerer, I waited until the house was silent. At 10 o'clock, I drove toward Park Avenue, the skyline of New York City a jagged crown of lights against the darkness. The law firm occupied 2 floors of a glass and steel skyscraper, a monument to the prestige Ethan so craved. I parked on a quiet side street, the silver key in my hand feeling heavy, the scales of justice keychain a cruel irony. The office was eerily quiet, the scent of expensive leather and Ethan's signature cologne hanging in the air like a shroud. I bypassed the main desk and went straight for the filing cabinets. I searched through rows of binders, wills, deeds, trust agreements, but nothing was read. My frustration mounted until my gaze landed on a small, unassuming cabinet in the corner, secured with a heavy padlock. It was out of place in such a modern office. I tried the keys on Ethan's spare ring, and on the third attempt, the lock clicked open. Inside, stacked with a neatness that bordered on pathological, were the red folders. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the first one. It was a will for a woman named Maria Andrade, leaving a vast estate to her godson, Ethan Hayes. The second, for a P.N. Castro, held a similar fortune. Then I found it, Jennings, C.S. Catherine Smith Jennings, my great-aunt Catherine. She had passed away 6 months ago, and she had promised me her inheritance. But here, in this folder, was a document stating she had left her Upper East Side apartment, her house in the Berkshires, and all her savings to a close family friend, Ethan Hayes. "You bastard," I hissed into the silence. I had seen the original will. Catherine had shown it to me herself. This was a forgery, a meticulous, professional fake. I took out my phone, my hands shaking with a cocktail of rage and triumph, and began photographing every single page. There were 7 folders in total, representing over $20 million in stolen legacies. I didn't stop there. I found a secondary cell phone in the drawer, unlocked with our son's birthday, a pathetic sentiment from a man who planned to kidnap him. The text messages between Ethan and Pamela were a roadmap of their crimes, detailing how they had tricked elderly clients into signing away their lives. I even accessed his laptop, finding digital blueprints of the fraud, money laundering schedules, and a final document that turned my blood to ice, a petition to strip me of parental rights, dated for the following day. He was going to use my grief and the financial ruin he'd engineered to prove I was unfit. He was going to take Noah and disappear to Italy with Pamela and the millions he'd stolen from my own family. I copied everything to a USB drive, my mind already spinning forward. He thought he was the smartest person in the room, but he had left his flank completely exposed. I locked the cabinet, turned off the lights, and stepped out into the drizzling New York night. The battle hadn't even begun, but I already knew how it would end. Ethan Hayes was coming home to a wife who no longer existed, replaced by a woman who would ensure he lost everything he had ever killed his soul to obtain. As I drove away from Park Avenue, I looked at the USB drive on the passenger seat. In 1 week, he had told Pamela they would be free. I intended to make sure that the only thing he'd be free of was his liberty. The betrayal hung in the evening air like a thick, cloying fog as I pulled into the parking lot of the coffee shop near our home. It was exactly 7 p.m. Earlier, I had gone through the motions of a normal life, picking up Noah from daycare, heating his dinner, and settling him in with Mrs. Davis. When his wide, innocent eyes looked up at me to ask when Daddy would be home, the word soon felt like a jagged stone in my throat. Now, I pushed open the door to a small, checkered tablecloth cafe that smelled of cinnamon and false comfort. Victor Serrano was already there. He looked exactly how I felt, frayed. He was a man with a kind, weary face, his fingers restlessly tapping against his watch until he saw me. When I sat down and looked into his worried eyes, I didn't offer the mercy of a slow revelation. I told him that his wife, Pamela, was not only sleeping with my husband, but was his primary partner in a criminal empire built on the bones of the elderly. Victor's face didn't just pale, it seemed to hollow out. He stammered about her working overtime for their future, about the bigger apartment they were saving for, and the life they were supposed to build. I laid the evidence out between us like a deck of tarot cards predicting a funeral, the airport photos, the text messages where she laughed about him being a burden she needed to discard, and the records of the $20 million they had siphoned from the vulnerable. I watched the kindness in his eyes die, replaced by a cold, sharpening needle of grief and rage. By the time our coffee was cold, we weren't just 2 cheated spouses, we were allies. Victor was practical in his pain. He agreed to monitor Pamela the moment she touched down, to record her admissions, and to hand over the digital copies of her life passports, tax returns, everything the bank had required for their recent loan application. We exchanged numbers with a grim nod, a silent pact sealed against the people who thought we were too weak to fight back. When I returned home, the darkness of the house was punctuated only by the glow of my laptop. Detective Castle had sent the full financial dossier. It was a map of greed that spanned continents, condos in Marbella, mountain retreats, and hidden veins of cash flowing into Swiss and Cypriot accounts. They had $7 million in liquid assets stashed away, a dragon's hoard meant to fund an Italian escape that I was about to turn into a prison sentence. The next morning, the sun felt like a spotlight on the new version of myself, the hunter. I walked into the NYPD precinct with a folder that contained enough evidence to bury Ethan and Pamela 10 times over. I watched Inspector Williams' eyes go wide as he flipped through the documents. He didn't see a domestic dispute. He saw a racketeering case. He handed me over to Detective Vargas, a woman whose sharp suit and sharper eyes signaled that the games were over. I sat in that station for 3 hours, detailing how I had found the evidence with the key my husband had given me. I wasn't a thief, I was a whistleblower. By the time I left, the machinery of the state was grinding into gear. I moved from the police station to Constantine Roth's office, where the legal noose was being braided. A divorce petition, full custody, and a $500,000 claim for emotional damages were just the opening gambit. That afternoon, I met the victims. I sat in a room with families like the Morales and the Castros, people who had been told their loved ones died penniless, while my husband was buying villas with their inheritances. Seeing their tears transformed my personal vendetta into a crusade. I wasn't just fighting for my son anymore. I was fighting for the dignity of every family Ethan had treated like a paycheck. The tension reached a breaking point that night when Castle called. They've landed. They're in a taxi. At 6:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with Ethan's name. His voice was terrifyingly normal, a masterclass in sociopathy. He lied about Chicago, lied about the formalities of Aunt Catherine's will, and tried to play the role of the tired businessman. When I casually asked how Pamela was, the silence on the other end was a confession in itself. "See you tonight," he said. "Of course, dear," I replied, smiling at the empty room. I stood in the back of the courtroom at 9:30 a.m., watching the man I once loved walk in with his mistress. They looked like the golden couple of the legal world. I caught Ethan's whispered promise to Pamela, one last million and they'd be free. I stepped forward then, appearing like a ghost at the feast. The blood drained from his face as I confronted him with the forged will and the systematic fraud. He tried to hide behind his impeccable reputation, but that shield shattered when Detective Vargas walked through the doors. The clink of handcuffs on Ethan's wrists was the most honest sound I'd heard in years. Pamela's professional facade dissolved into panicked shrieks, her first instinct being to scream that it was all his idea. As they were led away, Ethan looked at me with a pathetic, desperate confusion, pleading that we were family. I told him the truth. Our family died the moment he started robbing the dead. But the victory was short-lived. The stress that had been a silent companion for weeks finally took its toll. In the middle of a pharmacy, the world tilted and went black. I woke up in a sterile hospital room to the news that would haunt me forever. I had lost the baby. The child that Ethan had once joked might not make it to term was gone. I spent 3 days in a hollow silence, grieving a life that had been extinguished by the very stress Ethan had engineered. When I finally returned home and held Noah, I realized the stakes were even higher now. I had to be whole for him. But the shadows weren't finished. I received a call from the detention center. It was Pamela. She sounded broken, a discarded tool left to rust. She begged me to meet her, claiming she had information about Ethan's plans that would make my blood run cold. I sat across from her in the grim, gray visiting room of the jail. She looked like a ghost of the woman in the pink suit. She wept about her love for him, about the house in Italy, and then she dropped a final, sickening bombshell. She was pregnant with Ethan's child. My heart turned to lead as she revealed the darkest corner of my husband's soul. He hadn't just planned to divorce me and take my son. Pamela leaned in, her voice a trembling whisper, and told me that Ethan's true plan was to wait until I gave birth and then stage a postpartum accident. He wasn't just a thief, he was a man who had been waiting for the right moment to make me disappear forever. He planned to kill you. The words didn't just hang in the stagnant air of the prison visiting room, they pierced through me like shards of ice. I stared at Pamela, the woman who had helped dismantle my life, as she explained the true depth of Ethan's depravity. He didn't just want a divorce or the money, he wanted me erased. He had already been in contact with professional fixers, men who specialized in making obstacles disappear, and he had decided that a tragic bout of postpartum depression leading to a staged suicide was far cleaner than a legal battle over assets. My discovery at the airport hadn't just saved my inheritance, it had saved my life. Pamela, trembling and desperate for a shred of redemption, revealed that she had kept the one thing Ethan thought he had destroyed, the proof. She had screenshots of his negotiations with hitmen, saved on a small pink USB drive hidden in her dresser. She wasn't just giving me the keys to his prison cell, she was begging for her own soul back, asking me to tell Victor she was sorry and that the child she now carried was Ethan's. I didn't waste a second. I went straight to Detective Vargas, and the case shifted from a white-collar fraud investigation into a hunt for a cold-blooded conspiracy to commit murder. The raid on Pamela's apartment was swift. Victor, The man I had recently sat with in a coffee shop opened the door for the police with a face of stone, leading them to the pink box. On that drive, the horror became undeniable. I read the messages where my husband, the man who had held my hand through the birth of our first son, coolly negotiated a $200,000 price tag on my life. With the help of Detective Castle's underworld contacts, the police moved in on the hitmen, Miguel Moreno and Dennis Castano. They were professionals, the kind of men who made murders look like unfortunate accidents. Their arrest blew the doors off the entire operation. It wasn't just Ethan and Pamela anymore. It was a federal racketeering case involving real estate appraisers, agents, and a shadow figure Ethan referred to as Uncle Nick. I was summoned to a high-level briefing with Colonel Samuel Black, the head of an organized crime unit. He revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Ethan was just a soldier. The mastermind was Nicholas Ortega, the deputy commissioner of the IRS. This was a man who used his high-ranking government position to harvest the data of wealthy, isolated elderly people and feed them to Ethan like lambs to the slaughter. To catch a monster like Ortega, they needed a trap, and I was the bait. I had to go back into that detention center, look Ethan in the eye, and lie. I told him I wanted to save our family. I told him I forgave him. I watched the light of pathetic hope return to his eyes as he took the bait. He confessed everything: Ortega's name, the half-and-half profit splits, and the protection the commissioner provided. Ethan, terrified for his life, agreed to a staged escape to seek Ortega's help, unaware that every step he took was being broadcast to a fleet of federal agents. The climax unfolded at a luxury restaurant on the Gold Coast. Ethan, believing he was running for his life, pleaded with Ortega for a way out of the country. But Ortega was a shark who didn't keep liabilities. I watched the surveillance footage later as Ortega calmly ordered his bodyguards to take Ethan to the woods to be breakfast for the dogs. Before the hitmen could move, the doors burst open. The sight of Ortega in handcuffs, his cold gaze finally meeting the reality of a life sentence, was the justice I had bled for. The fallout was a national scandal. The case of the century dominated every headline, but for me, the victory was quiet and personal. The divorce was finalized in minutes. Ethan was sentenced to 31 years in a maximum security facility, while Ortega received life. Pamela, for her cooperation, was given 3 years. She chose to keep the child, a living reminder of the mess she had made, and moved away to start over in the shadows. 5 years have passed since the night the world fell apart at JFK. I sold the New York apartment and moved to a house with a sprawling garden where the air is clean and the silence is peaceful. I am no longer just Emily Hayes, the victim. I am a woman who rebuilt her world on a foundation of truth. I didn't do it alone. Victor Serrano, the man who lost his wife to the same web of lies, stayed by my side. What started as shared trauma grew into a steady, honest love. We married in a simple ceremony attended by the families we helped save, the Morales, the Castros, and the others who finally received their stolen legacies. Noah, now a bright and happy boy, finally has the father he deserves in Victor. One evening, as we sat on the terrace watching Noah play with his little sister, Anna, I realized that the nightmare was truly over. Trust had been hard to win back, but Victor was an open book. He never gave me a reason to look for a red folder or a hidden phone. My life as a doctor continues, but my greatest work is the peace I've cultivated within these walls. Ethan is a ghost in a cell. A man who traded his soul for a fortune he never got to spend. I looked at my family, the real drawing Noah had made coming to life at last, and I finally understood what it meant to be free. Justice hadn't just been served, it had allowed us to live.